Everybody's favorite topic, membrane potential. Who went back and reviewed membrane potential since we've looked at it previously? Hopefully everybody. If you haven't, tonight's tonight. Wednesday night, you guys have a hot date with some membrane potential. Because it's important that you understand how we get a generic voltage measured. Everything moving forward is going to be about how we manipulate and change that voltage. So if you don't understand how we got there in the first place, you'll never understand how we're able to manipulate it. So these are the same notes that we had up previously. So nothing new here, but it's worth going back over. Remember, a potential is a voltage created. We have a battery. It's the same thing I said a few weeks ago. If we have a battery, we can connect a wire to each of the terminals and observe a voltage going through that wire. We observe a potential going through that wire. Do the same thing with the membrane. We can hook up electrodes to that wire on the intracellular side and the extracellular side and witness a voltage created by the actions across that membrane. We mentioned before that usually in a cell, minus 70 millivolts is a typical membrane voltage. Now, don't get hung up on the number. The exact number of this is somewhat irrelevant. Neurons are normally minus 70 millivolts. Muscle cells are a little different. Cardiac SA node cells are a little different again. But I do want to draw your attention to this minus. These are not integers. You're not in some sort of voltage debt by having a negative sign there. That negative sign is meant to indicate direction of current flow. If you had a voltage running in this direction, that could be negative. If it was going in the opposite direction, we simply switch the electrons around, then that would be positive. It's meant to indicate direction of current flow. So the further we get away from zero, the intensity of the voltage is the same. A positive 70 voltage and a minus 70 voltage is just as intense. Now, when we look at a battery, if you've ever cut one in half as a kid to peek inside, you'll see the inside of that battery has chambers. If you've ever seen a car battery, very often the plastic can be clear and you can even see the liquid inside. Separating chambers of different charges in those compartments. And that's important to picture because as a battery sits on a shelf, it's not developing a voltage. The charges stay separated. So when we look at the cell and compare apples to oranges, so to speak, we have to look at where the charges are separated in the cell as well. And we had 5 different ions that we were concerned about. Five different ions. You'll have to know where these ions reside, where the high concentrations of each happen to be naturally. And we can use a little mnemonic, learning aid, let's call it that, to help you remember where 3 of the 5 are. The concept of a salty banana. Salty referring to sodium chloride. We see high concentrations of sodium and chloride ions outside of the cell. Sodium happens to be the most prominent extracellular electrolyte, regardless of cell. Bananas, you probably heard, are high in potassium. With the neuron, we see high concentrations of potassium inside the cell. So potassium inside, sodium and chloride ions outside the cell. And in particular, we maintain the imbalance of sodium and potassium across that membrane using the sodium-potassium pump. We mentioned this when we did active transport. We break down an ATP at the sodium-potassium pump, and every time we do, we pump 3 positively charged sodium ions outside the cell, and we pump 2 positively charged potassium ions in the cell to maintain those concentration gradients. So that's 3 of the 5. Outside of those 3, we've got negatively charged proteins and amino acids. They naturally occur inside the cell. And we've got calcium ions in high concentrations outside the cell. So we've got these 5 different ions with 5 distinct concentration gradients. And this is our scenario. We see our high concentrations of sodium, chloride, and calcium outside the cell. We see our high concentrations of potassium and amino acids inside the cell. This picture is going to be similar to the way we talked about a battery when it sits on the shelf. No voltage is happening right here and now. Just like the battery still sitting in the package isn't generating a charge. If we want that battery to create a voltage, we got to take a wire and connect the terminals. And without knowing anything about electricity, somehow in your mind you're picturing something going through that wire. Some sort of flow, some sort of current. These are all words we start to use for electricity. Something's going through that wire, connecting the terminals. So it should give you some sort of appreciation that the generation of the actual voltage is a dynamic state, not a static state. So this is where the ion concentrations reside, but this isn't the way we create a voltage. We need to observe what these ions do to travel back and forth the membrane, because it's the movement that they exhibit is what will give us the measurable voltage created. Just like when you connect the wires to a battery, whatever movement is happening inside that wire gives us the measurable voltage. So when we did this before, we basically scaled it down. We can't talk about the movement of 5 different ions at once without making your head hurt. Admittedly, when you're first learning this, is already bad enough. So we strip it down. We're going to look at one ion. We're going to look at what that ion does, and we're going to apply that exact same principle to the other 4. It's as simple as we can make it. Potassium is a great place to start. Potassium is high concentration inside the cell, low concentration outside the cell. What type of transport did we talk about that involved the movement of a solute from a high concentration to a low? Diffusion. In this case, because it's an ion, we're talking about facilitated diffusion. We will always see diffusion occur from a high concentration to a low. So we witness potassium leaking out of that cell along its concentration gradient. Now, this is one of those times when I love the way terms are actually used. These are leaking out of that cell by what is literally called potassium leak channels. I love it when the names apply directly to what you're trying to explain. Potassium leak channels. Now, how did the potassium get in that cell in the first place? How did we create a high concentration of potassium inside? What pump did we mention? Sodium-potassium pump. We're pumping potassium in, it's leaking back out. When we did active transport before, remember, we're always fighting against diffusion. You're pumping it in, but you'll never get it all pumped across the membrane. Because the stronger of a concentration gradient you create, the stronger the force you've created for diffusion back across in the opposite direction. If you were in the middle of a lake with a rowboat that was leaking, and they gave you a bucket, the water comes through the cracks in the boat, you bail it out. You are actively transporting water outside the boat. You've created a strong concentration gradient, hopefully, of water outside the boat relative to inside the boat. What happens if you stop bailing? The boat continues to fill up until it equalizes and your boat sinks. So we need to keep our active transport going at all times, continuously pumping potassium in order to stay ahead of the diffusion that's going in the opposite direction. Now, what sort of relationship do we see between positive and negative ions? What do they like to do for each other? They attract each other. Remember our ionic bonding. We had negative ions in here paired up with the potassium, right? So if we lose the potassium, look what we left behind. An unpaired, negatively charged ion. Not a big deal. You lose one potassium, you leave behind one negatively charged ion. You lose another potassium, you leave behind a second unpaired ion. You lose a third potassium, you leave behind a third unpaired, negatively charged ion. That eventually catches up with you. Because now we've got this attractive force of negatives and positives pulling potassium back across again in the opposite direction. It diffuses out along its concentration gradient. But once we get a big enough difference of positives and negatives across that membrane, the negatives are going to start to attract it back in again. So that same potassium is pulled back inside the cell again along a force called the electrochemical gradient. It leaves the cell by its concentration gradient. It's pulled back across again in the opposite direction because of the created electrochemical gradient. Now, if we picture this happening on a constant state, potassium's leaving, re-entering, leaving, re-entering, leaving, re-entering. Now it looks like a current. Now we've kind of got what we've pictured all along when the wires connect up the terminals of a AAA battery, and you're envisioning something going from positive terminal to negative constantly. Once we've created this situation, we get this revolving door of potassium ions. At that point, we can measure a voltage strictly because of the actions of those potassium ions. We have an equation called the Nernst equation. You guys won't have to actually calculate anything. But we can use the Nernst equation to calculate an equilibrium potential. Remember, potential means voltage. An equilibrium potential is going to be the voltage created by a single ion. So we've got our concentration of potassium outside the cell divided by the concentration of potassium inside the cell. Take the log of that division, multiply it by a constant based on the fact that we're moving a single positively charged ion each time. And you will get a calculated voltage strictly because of the actions of potassium. And for potassium, it winds up being approximately minus 92 millivolts. So that's potassium. That gives us one individual equilibrium potential. Take that concept now and apply it to the other four ions. But keeping in mind, the directions may change. The reason potassium diffuses out along its concentration gradient is because potassium was in high concentrations inside the cell to start with. Sodium is going to be in high concentrations out here. Which way is it going to diffuse? Into the cell. So we will see sodium enter the cell through sodium leak channels, created by the force of its concentration gradient pushing it in, leaving behind unpaired chloride ions, pulling it back across along its electrochemical gradient. So the forces are the same, but the directions can be different because each of these 5 ions is starting in a particular place. But the overall movement and pattern is exactly the same. And we can create or measure or calculate an equilibrium potential for all 5 of those ions. And once they're all doing their thing together, to kind of use a mathematical term very loosely, we can take the average of all of the individual voltages created to get an overall voltage in the cell. And that's kind of what we do. And average is not the right word to use because some of these ions move across the membrane more readily than others. So if they all don't have the same impact, they don't all have the same concentration gradients. But if we look at those 5 individual equilibrium potentials, we get an overall voltage created. And in this case, that's going to be minus 70 millivolts. So is everybody with me so far? It's already a lot to digest, I understand. So this is what we've accomplished thus far. This was back right after membrane transport. If you are lost now, this is what you have to get first. So at least between now and next Monday, that should be your goal. Understanding straightforward membrane potential. Because now we're going to take that base state and manipulate it. Because in the neuron, this isn't good enough. This is where the conversation would end if we were talking about an osteocyte, a non-excitable cell. Neurons are excitable, means we get fluctuations in the voltage. And you haven't been in A&P very long, but you've been in it long enough to know that we like to name the hell out of stuff. Every bump on a bone that you're going to look at in lab has a name. Every fluctuation in voltage that's related to this cell's function, we want to give it a term so that we're not using diagrams to always communicate. But I can verbally explain to you what's going on with the voltage in this neuron, and using the appropriate terms, you will know what I'm describing, right? So in an osteocyte, membrane potential will be the end of the story. In an excitable cell like a neuron, it's not. We would use this term and minus 70 millivolts as a measurement to refer to the voltage of a neuron at rest, meaning it's not being impacted in any other way, and especially by another neuron. The voltage of a neuron at rest is its resting membrane potential. And in our case, we're going to use minus 70 millivolts. So now we've got to start naming what happens when we change the voltage. How can we change the voltage? You're picturing here now, hopefully, potassium doing its thing, leaving and re-entering, leaving and re-entering. You're picturing calcium doing its thing, entering and leaving, entering and leaving. Sodium entering and leaving, chloride entering and leaving. You're picturing all these 5 ions doing their shuffle, creating a voltage. and the average is minus 70 millivolts. How can we disrupt minus 70 millivolts and change it? Any guesses? Doesn't have to be technical. How would you do it? What about if we opened up a door in this cell that allowed sodium to enter faster? Would that throw off the equilibrium potential created by sodium? Therefore, it would throw off the average that we wind up measuring as a resting membrane potential. So any fluctuations in voltage that we're going to observe is because we've disrupted the equilibrium of at least one of those ions as it fluxes back and forth. We slow that transport down or we speed that transport up. And as a result, we see a deviation in the voltage being measured. Yes, David.
So at a base level, unless you for example, open that door, are these ions moving in and out at the exact same, maybe not rate, but same speed? And then is that why if you allow them to go in and out faster, you can change that voltage?
Each of those 5 ions is going to go back and forth that membrane at their own individual rate, not the same rate.
Gotcha, okay.
Remember, when we talked about diffusion, one of the main things that we said dictated the rate was the strength of the concentration gradient, the surface area available for transport. In this case, they're all ions, so the nature of the solute stays the same. So each of these ions is going to have their own particular rate, which is why I made a point to say we're not truly taking the average, because each individual doesn't contribute equally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
But as it's in its resting state, those 5 ions are constantly doing their individual movements. If we disrupt the rate of any single one, we impact its individual contribution. Therefore, we impact the overall voltage. Does that make more sense now?
Yeah, it sure does.
Good. Okay, deviations from resting. And we'll just put that in your back of your mind for a moment, because we're going to go off on a bit of a tangent before we can move on. In order for us to change voltage, we've got to let different ions cross that membrane at different rates than they were originally doing so, right? So now we have to talk about the channels. If we're going to change the rate that potassium and sodium and calcium goes across that membrane, we do so by impacting the doors in which they go through. We've got 3 different ones we're going to illustrate, and admittedly the first one doesn't count for descriptive purposes. Mechanically gated channels. These are channels that we see in a cell membrane that will open up and allow solutes to pass through if they're mechanically deformed. If you remember back to when we did transport, there was a couple of slides that had like illustrations of what these channels are, right? Let's draw this one being closed. These ends are touching. If we took this membrane and physically distorted it, it could open up that channel and let solutes pass through, right? Everybody in here has experienced the effects of opening up a mechanically gated channel. Is there anybody in here that has not hit their funny bone? Usually that ulnar nerve is nicely protected in that ulnar groove. However, if you hit it just right, and you compress that ulnar nerve up against the side of the electron process, you mechanically deform the axons channels that are there. Now granted, those are called voltage-gated channels, we'll get to in a minute. But you mechanically deform them, and you open them up because of that physical deformation. What happens when you open up those channels? You get this zingy pins and needles sensation all the way down into the 4th and 5th digits, right? Every single time. Mechanical deformation of tissue opens up mechanically gated channels. Later on when we do sensation, we'll talk about these again. You run your fingers over a brick. Those little bumps on the page are mechanically deforming the tissue on your fingertips and opening different receptors with these mechanically gated channels. The degree in which you deform the tissue will open up a greater number of receptors, and you can get a gradient of tactile sensation. So, again, we don't need to know that one, but it helps us carry on and illustrate. If mechanical deformation of tissue opens up mechanically gated channels, what's going to open up chemically gated channels? Shout it out when you know it. If mechanical deformation of tissue opens up a mechanically gated channel, what opens up a chemically gated channel?
Chemical imbalance.
Chemical presence, yeah. If a particular chemical is present, it'll bind to a chemically gated channel and cause it to open. Bit of a lock and key kind of mentality. Specific chemicals open up specific channels. What chemicals have we already talked about today that might play a role in opening up these channels? What was stored at the end of an axon? Neurotransmitters. That's an example of a chemical that could be released from one neuron, go to another neuron, bind to a chemically gated channel, open up that channel, and let solutes pass through. Nicotine is a chemical that can open up certain channels. Any number of chemicals can open up or close or block, for that matter, certain channels. But the one we'll be talking about functionally, real life scenario, is going to be the neurotransmitter. Hormones will open up channels in cells in the same way. We will only see chemically gated channels in the nude parts of the cell. Dendrites, cell bodies. We only see chemically gated channels exist in the dendrites and the cell bodies. So, mechanical deformation of tissue opened up a mechanically gated channel. The presence of a particular chemical opened up a chemically gated channel. What opens up a voltage gated channel?
Voltage.
That's where the logic takes, right? This is where my analogy kind of falls apart just a little bit. Voltage is already occurring. What opens up a voltage gated channel is a particular degree of change in voltage. You need the voltage around that channel to change by a particular amount. We're already at minus 70 millivolts. It needs to deviate from minus 70 millivolts, a predetermined amount, then it opens. We only see voltage gated channels along the axons. And because we're looking at a predetermined voltage change, we call that a threshold. These channels, chemical and voltage, are either open or closed. In the first couple of weeks of 139, you'll see that's a little bit of a fib. But for now, works great. They're either open or they're closed. It stays closed until we get the specific chemical that opens it up. It stays closed until we get a large enough change in voltage around it. For the voltage-gated channels, we call that a threshold. You have to hit their particular threshold, and then they will open up. So now we can go back to where we left off. We talked about a resting membrane potential and how we need to describe changes in said potential. And we can only evoke a change by allowing ions to cross that membrane at greater rates through the channels that we have present. So now let's look at what these channels actually accomplish electrically. The first deviation from resting that we can discuss is called a graded potential. A graded potential. We see graded potentials as a deviation from resting when we open up chemically gated channels. The opening of a chemically gated channel results in a graded potential. Where in the cell will we see a graded potential? What parts of the neuron? Only the parts that have the chemically gated channels, which are dendrites and cell bodies. We only see chemically gated channels in dendrites and cell bodies, so therefore we only see graded potentials in dendrites and cell bodies. Why do we call it a graded potential? What does the word graded mean? What types of things do you come in contact with every day that are graded?
Yes.
Yeah, exams. Exam 1 is not a good example of a graded stuff, I'll tell you that. Simply wasn't. But graded, in the greater scheme of things, implies that it's incremental. And in an exam, you had the opportunity to get 0 or 100, or logically, anywhere in between in 2% increments, right? A slope can be graded. You'll see if you're on the highway sometimes, for truckers and such, you will see the grade of the road posted. Because it's incrementally increasing as you go. A ruler is graded, a measuring cup is graded, because it's broken down into smaller increments. I'm hoping that exam 2 is also a bad example of something being graded. Hopefully we scale them all upwards. A graded potential, based on its name, implies that it's a localized change, but it is variable and incremental. We can have a small graded potential. We can have a little bit larger graded potential. We can have a little bit larger again graded potential, and so on. It's incremental. An action potential is a deviation of voltage created when we open up a voltage-gated channel. Where do we find action potentials in the cell? The axon, because that's the only place we see voltage-gated channels, right? Now, an action potential is a big change in voltage. None of this little tiny, small incremental changes. And it's non-variable. An action potential is a rubber stamp. There is no such thing as a big action potential or a small action potential. There are just action potentials. We will see the same pattern of voltage change occur whenever we discuss action potentials. So much so that the next semester when you guys do cardio and you start talking about heart rate, you will see the SA node of the heart, the pacemaker, will discharge and send out an action potential at a regular rate, resulting in the 70-odd beats per minute that you could get. If you want to make the heart beat faster, you cannot change the action potential. All you can do is cut down the time in between each action potential. So to make the heart beat faster, you're not doing anything about the beat. You're simply removing the time between the beats. each beat still stays the same electrically. So an action potential is a rubber stamp, only created by the opening of voltage-gated channels. They're the same every time. And because of the voltage-gated channels had that threshold, these need to reach a certain voltage in order for us to get an action potential to occur. And once it starts, there is no stopping it. An action potential, again, there's no big ones, there's no small, there's no partial ones. It's all or none. Either you hit the threshold value for the voltage-gated channel, create a full action potential, or you don't. This is what we see. Now, if we took those three different types of voltage, the resting membrane potential, the graded potential, and the voltage, the action potential. And we're quickly running out of time, but I want to get us to a certain point here. Here is your resting membrane potential. Here is your action potential. That entire pattern, from here, where the voltage-gated channels open up because of the threshold, that sharp spike upwards, the immediate sharp spike back down, a little bit of an overshoot, then a correction. This entire thing is the action potential. But to put some of these pieces of information together now, look at what we have connecting the resting membrane potential to the action potential. We've got this little bit of voltage change right here. What is that? We talked about three different types of voltage: resting, action, and graded. This is a graded potential. Small and incremental, so we can take this graded potential and fluctuate it. No action potential, no action potential. Oh, close, but no action potential. As soon as you hit threshold,